gonna do right now, we're gonna bolt the flywheel and the clutch on. We're not gonna like final bolt it on. All we're doing that for is to be able to measure how we're gonna space out the throb bearing. We have actually a threaded, you can't really see it right now because I have it locked in, but it's a threaded throb bearing. So we got to figure out a way to mount this plate to the bell housing, and then you can unscrew and screw this to adjust how far in and out it goes. And you want there to be basically 0.1 to 0.15 of an inch of distance when this is fully seated back like that before it actually touches the fingers of the clutch, because of the clutch wearing, and you also just don't want it constantly riding on it like that. So that's what we're about to measure, and we're gonna bolt the clutch on here, the bell housing, we're gonna just kind of push it on and hold it there, and we'll take the measurement, and then we're gonna go over the transmission and take a measurement so that we know where to put this. So what we're about to do, we're going to measure the depth from the face of this bell housing to the face of the throw-out bearing that's going to be touching the clutch forks. The way you're going to do that, you'll take this straight edge, hold it up to the face of the bell housing. You'll take a caliper like this, and you will touch it to where the clutch forks touch the throw-out bearing, and you'll push this down until it hits the face of the straight edge you put across here. And we'll take that measurement, and the measurement is 4.581. All right, and so did I bring my notebook in here?
Yeah.
Go grab my notebook. So we'll write down 4.581 inches, and then we'll take you got to subtract the width of the ruler from it. This is probably a 1-inch ruler, but I just like to measure it because we're trying to be somewhat exact here. And it is, see, a little bit bigger than 1 inch, so it's a good thing I did. It is 1.251, so it's 1¼ inch wide. So the ruler's 0.251, and we'll need that for when we measure the engine too, so it's good to just keep that measurement in your head. We got to subtract these two numbers. Once you subtract these two numbers, so the distance between the face of this bell housing and the face of this throw-out bearing right here is 3.33 inches, all right? So we need the distance that the clutch forks, when it sits in here, to be between this throw-out bearing and those clutch forks to be 0.15, or really somewhere in between 0.1 and 0.15. So like 0.125 would be a good number to shoot for. So we need to subtract subtract 0.15 or 125 from here. So that would be 33 minus, let's say 12. What is 33 minus 12? That'd be 21. So 3.21 is what we really want the clutch to be. Now the problem is we can't adjust the clutch. We can adjust this though. If the clutch is more than this, we cannot adjust it anymore, because right now the throw-out bearing is all the way back. So now we need to go over and measure the clutch. Now, right now, we can't fully bolt on the clutch pressure plate because this is the most expensive one you can buy on eBay. And the little holes for the dowel pins don't quite line up, so we got to drill those out a little bigger. No big deal, but it is, obviously kind of an issue. Okay, so what we're going to measure now, we're going to measure the distance from the face of this engine where the bell housing mounts to these forks. Now, because this is not pushed together all the way, because like I said, these dowel pins don't go in because it's a cheap clutch, this will have to be subtracted from that measurement. But also, it's when you push it in all the way, it will make these forks go out some. Now, if I think about that correctly, the forks should actually go out the same distance that this would come in, so I really probably wouldn't have to subtract that, right?
That's what I was.
Yeah, so then we should just be able to measure it like that. So we'll try that first. Really what we're trying to figure out is if the throw-out bearing is going to work with the little pedestal we have on it, or if we're going to have to just take that pedestal off and use shims to adjust it. So let's measure that real quick and see what we got. So we'll have Tanner hold the straight edge. We're gonna have to kind of get it in a way where it sits on across these.
Here, move.
Well, maybe even turning it like this would be better.
Sure, yeah.
And then we got to measure to right here. Problem is that's gonna be all wibbly wobbly, so it's not gonna be real accurate. But again, this is just to get in the ballpark. And what I am about getting is right about there, which is 4.1228. So let's go back over to our piece of paper, kind of draw this out so we can kind of see what we're working with here. So right now we have the engine right here with the clutch sticking off of it, and the distance between this face and here, we'll do little forks right here. This face is 4.228. All right. Now we have the bell housing over here, which eventually will be attached, but we have it right here. And the distance of this face to, and here's the throwout bearing, to that face is 3.33. So as you can see, that is going to hit that before it won't ever even fully seat. So we need to make up about an inch right here. The only way I can think of to make up that inch is to take off this little pedestal, which doesn't look like an inch wide. So we may be fucked.
Nice. All right, let's see if taking off the...
And this might all be incorrect anyway too, because those forks might not move as much as, or might move less or more than we're thinking. This is kind of just all a guesstimation, but I'm trying to see how you're pushing that in. Turn it the other way, and we'll that way we know it's more
rigid.
All right, so now we have right here, ironically, we have 5.132. So we have 5.132, which we need to take off an inch and a quarter. So 5.132 minus 1,251. Let me see your calculator, please.
You gonna do that math?
Dude.
3.881. So we gained half an inch by doing that, which still should not be enough.
That's very strange.
It's just a little dusty is all. So here's what we did. If you look in here, we had to move the holes for this bell housing because it's a Chevy bell housing on a Ford transmission. down in a little bit on both sides. We threaded them and everything. So now this is bolted on. The only thing is the bottom bolts are not holding it in at all. So what you do for that is you take a piece of metal, it's a plate, you go straight across here, and then you weld 2 down like offshoots like this, so it comes like that. And then you can bolt the bottom bolts in, and then you use a bolt and a nut right here to attach it to the bottom side of the transmission. Then you got all 4 of your bolts holding your transmission to the bell housing. Nothing crazy. We did have to clearance the bottom of the bell housing. It's really like ugly right now. We're going to clean it up. But that's because the clutches that older small block Chevys used, which is what this bell housing is off of, were 10.5-inch clutches. That's a 12-inch clutch. So the bottom had to be clearanced. The top is still fine, partially because newer small block and older one uses the same pattern, so it would have to work. Otherwise, it wouldn't fit in the engine, and neither would that flywheel. We got to clearance this a little bit more. I need to cut this more like right there to get it to fit. And then on this side, I want to cut a little bit off of the starter area because I think the starter is probably going to hit when we do that. A lot of people would probably be kind of skeptical about us cutting it this way, but I have this exact same bell housing on my Corvette, and the only part of this bell housing that mounts to the engine is these bolts, and these 2 bolts. Everything down here is just a cover. Doesn't actually have any structure to it or anything on the older cars. So cutting this off shouldn't affect the structural integrity any. Now, are these as strong as like a scattered bell housing? No, not even close, but they should still be plenty strong enough to hold everything together. We also were able to get the bell housing, because of clearancing this, attached to the transmission with the clutch installed, and we were able to figure out that the throttle bearing is going to work. But we can't use the threaded piece, which I have sitting somewhere over here. I don't know where.
Just fell in the...
Oh, okay, that's what that noise was.
Yeah.
So the threaded piece we can't use, so what we're going to have to do is just slide this straight in here like this. Well, without the threaded piece, it just isn't quite far enough out. It needs to be out about like this. So our idea is, if you look in here, it hits these bolts, is what the first thing it hits. Now, I've seen people do this in other throttle bearings. We're going to put washers behind those bolts to space it out. I've already went to Home Depot, measured the washers out we have. If the right washers, longer bolts, so we just got to install those. And that'll give us our spacing. Then we need to drill a hole on this side of the throttle bearing, or of the bell housing, because this throttle bearing has 2, like an in and an out basically. So some of them will have a in and then just have a bleeder screw next to it. This one just has an in and an out so that you can mount a remote bleeder screw, which makes it a little easier to bleed. So what we're gonna have to do is I have one hose that already came with this one that's gonna come out this side to go to the actual car, where the line comes from the slave cylinder, or the master cylinder. And then this line is going to come out this end, or maybe the bottom, and that's going to be the bleeder screw. So that's the next thing we got to do. Once we get that figured out, we should be able to mate the transmission to the engine. And actually physically putting all this in the car is actually probably going to be easier than trying to put it together to itself. So once we do that, it should be a lot smoother.
And we also need to drill one more hole on the other side, because both the bleeder and fill
are on opposite sides.
Spots are on opposite sides, yeah.
So that's our next step. We're gonna have to go to a rubber specialties place, is what it's called. It just has a bunch of different fittings and rubber lines and stuff to make that work, which we got to pull the line off the car to figure out what thread it's gonna be, how to adapt it. And so that's the next steps. Figure out the rest of the stuff for the throttle bearing, and then put everything together to the engine, put it in the car. Alright, so I'm going to show you guys something that I learned. I learned this from a dude online. When you're cutting a bolt off, if it's like a nut or something that you can screw it all the way through, you can leave it into this. You cut it off, and then once you cut it off, if it was outside of this, sometimes it can be hard to get it started in because you can mess the threads up. Well, if you cut it while it's inside something like this one over here, when I go to unscrew this, it gets to the part where the threads are messed up. It'll get a little stiffer, but it'll actually fix the threads. And so now I can take this bolt, once I unscrew it all the way, and it'll screw back in just as good as an original bolt would, because it was almost like re-threaded when we pulled it out. Also, in this particular case, it gives us a way to hold these bolts because this flywheel is very heavy. So that's just a tip that I learned online a while back. And if you can do this, it saves a lot of time having to clean up the threads. You can actually see right here where it kind of moved them a little bit. You can kind of break off that extra bit just on anything, but that fixes the end of the threads for you. Come over here so it doesn't shoot sparks on me. So right now we've got the throwout bearing in here. If you can see up here, this is the washers we use to space the throwout bearing out. We ended up measuring them. That was within spec. They were actually just some washers we got at Home Depot, but they kind of worked out to be the right amount. We've got the lines we got made by the rubber hydraulic shop, and we will be putting a grommet on this, so don't worry about it rubbing through. It would if we didn't, though, so that is something like if you put a rubber hose through a metal hole like this, you want to put a grommet on it. Over here, which you might be a little confused about if you know anything about throwout bearings, is we have a port that goes in, and then this would technically normally be the port where you would bleed the air out of the system, but it isn't. It's just a bolt. Well, the car itself actually has a bleeder where it connects to the car. So that was kind of interesting, but it makes it easier on us at least.
We'll show you guys that.
Yeah, the only thing that I'm a little worried about is that if this is higher than that, if an air bubble could get trapped in here, and not. But we'll just have to see. I mean, if it gets if it's to the point where we have to worry about that, we'll take it all back apart if we have to. But I think we're gonna be fine. So what we did to make the transmission actually mate to the bell housing is we made this bracket. We saw this online. So basically, what you do is you drill the top 2 holes in the existing flange of the bell housing, and then down here these 2 holes don't line up, but there are 2 holes that would normally be where you would bolt a Chevy transmission up to this. So we made this little L bracket thing to attach those, and this is straight off of a forum we saw online. Works great. It was relatively easy for what it is. He welded it together, we bolted it together, mainly because we actually have access to a welder, but we don't really know how to weld, and the guy that we do know that kind of knows how to weld is out of town, so this is kind of our thing. If it ends up not working out, we could always weld it if we wanted to. The other thing that that I was wanting to explain was that we had to cut the bell housing. We did eventually do final cuts on that, smooth it out so it's not all sharp anymore. But basically, like what I was saying earlier, the flywheel's just too big around for it to fit underneath here, so we just kind of clearanced it. A lot of automatic transmission bell housings are already like this to begin with, so it shouldn't be a problem or anything. So our next step is to mate this to the engine, but that's pretty much what this is showing, is how you can mate a Ford T5 to a Chevy bell housing without buying one of those like $300 adapters. This probably cost us $50 maybe. Are you still recording?
Yep.
Other thing, this transmission, and maybe one of you guys can tell me what this is. So when I looked up a bunch of T5s, I was trying to figure out which one we had so we could know what we needed to get as far as adapters go. So if you look, this has got the Chevy, from what I understand at least, the Chevy transmission mount. So it's at an angle. It's not a flat across with the plane of the transmission. It's an angled one, which from what I was told or what I saw online came in Chevy V6, like Camaros and things like that. But up here, it's got the Ford pattern for the bell housing, which from what I could tell from pictures is actually how the Chevy V6 transmissions are set up. So you would think that it's just a Chevy V6 transmission. Well, what makes me not think that, or makes me confused, is that the splines on the input shaft is a 26 spline, which is what a Ford transmission would have, or a V8 version of a T5 would have, which would then cause it to have the other style of bell housing flange. So what it almost seems like someone did is they took a Ford T5 with a 26 spline input shaft and put a Chevy tail housing on it and like put it in a Camaro for some reason. Don't really know why you would do that, or if that even is what happens, but maybe one of you guys can explain us a little bit more about these T5s, what transmission this is or what it came out of that maybe would have came with this type of application from the factory. But that was just an interesting weirdness that I noticed about it. But it works out good for us because the flywheel and clutch and everything that we want to use is made for a 26 spline input shaft. So it kind of worked out just without us even knowing it. I mean, we got this transmission for like $250 online. It was literally the cheapest one we could find on Facebook, just like the engine. So it was just kind of what we could get our hands on, and it ended up kind of being good and bad. So I just thought I'd run that by you guys and see what you thought. But we're about to mate the transmission to the engine, and then we're gonna try and put the engine in the car.
We also drilled a hole right here in the old. Well, we drilled a new hole. Here, shine the flashlight so you can. There.
Which hole are you looking for?
That. Showing where we blocked the throttle bearing from spinning.
Oh, so that actually isn't a new hole though. That's the original hole that would have bolted up the Chevy.
Oh yeah, because we did find the.
We
right.
were going to use. What we were originally going to do was use this hole right here, which would have been where the little pivot ball goes for the clutch fork. Couldn't find anything that had that thread in town, and then we decided, well, we'll just get an extra bolt and just drill another hole and tap it. Well, turns out the bolt that we got for this is the perfect length to put another bolt right here, and we made sure this doesn't hit the flywheel, or sorry, the clutch either. So it just kind of fell in place, and we didn't really have to do anything else. So we just did that. It was easier, less work. So
Now we'll spin.
now it won't spin exactly. So we're looking right now at how we're gonna route the throttle bearing hydraulics, and we're looking at the stock place. This is where it comes out in the stock car, and our throttle bearing has two fittings on it. One of them is supposed to be for the bleeder, one's supposed to be for the feed. So normally on a race style throttle bearing like that, you'll have one hose coming out that goes into this, and then the other hose will come out and have a bleeder on it to bleed the throttle bearing. Well, this one actually has a little bleeder on this block, so all we have to do is block off the other hole in that throttle bearing, and we can just send this straight to it. And the nice thing about that is the place that we have in town that carries hydraulic hoses and stuff, I wasn't sure if they were going to have that piece for us, so we already have one on the car. I've never seen a car set up like this, but it's actually pretty convenient for what we're doing. So
Saves a lot of time.
yeah.
We live.
All right, so I'm gonna drop this back down, Tanner. So guide it for me. Shit, fire. Got that tight.
I wish we could have got when I dropped it that one time.
That was hilarious. We do have to change the oil pan before we put it in the car too. Remember?
I don't understand how what's his name does it that way.
What do you mean? Oh, hits it?
Yeah.
Dude, he's good.
Without it just dropping.
Yeah. So I might need you to when we're pushing this wheelie, I might need you to just set your hand there so it doesn't slide forward. All right. Grab the transmission.
Maybe, baby.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we'll just shove it on the pin so it stays. Yeah,
Get the bolts. Yeah. I was thinking that in my head. Oh, dude. That's the easiest we've ever done.
Easy.
Hold the back of this up, I'll grab the bolt. That's the easiest ones ever went in. I mean, that was like easy as fuck.
Usually that process takes
Like,
20 minutes.
yeah, literally 20 minutes of us going,
Jiggle, 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 jiggle.
get 2 bolts in it, and then we'll get that back gun.
For my truck, it just didn't.
No, it
didn't want to do it.
It didn't want to, yeah, it was not happy. When we had to do it while the engine was in the truck, and it was like a really weird circumstance of how we had to do it too. Made it way harder than it had to be. Other side, 1 bolt in on the other side, and then we should be good to. Nope. Alright. Nope.
This is gonna be so funny when it works.
It's gonna be like almost shocked in a way, but not. I mean, we did a lot of research when we were doing this to make sure that we're not completely stupid. You know, we're. I wish Phil would wait for the rest of it. Mission are working.
And the fact that you can't spin it when it's in
Yeah.
here and spin it when it.
Yeah, neutral working. Go further back. Now you can start. So like that part of it's working.
Yeah.